Alex, we're hearing a lot about energy transition these days, and there's a lot of regulatory activity around that. Can you tell us what that means from your perspective?
Yes, thank you, Mark. So energy transition describes the global shift away from fossil fuels towards a more sustainable, renewable sourcing of electricity for all our needs. And it's really characterized by a couple of things. The first is the increasing amount of renewable power on our system, lots of offshore wind and solar, for example. The second is the increasing electrification of everything. We're increasingly electrifying transport, rail, electric vehicles and so on, but also looking to electrify our heat. The third is the rise of technology and the role of technology in energy transition, which is making the market more dynamic, more flexible, and providing opportunities for businesses to monetize that flexibility. And the fourth is a trend on the demand side, which is that we're seeing corporates with real commitments to ESG and green, engaging with the market and wanting to participate in a way that's never been seen before. Mark, from your perspective, what are you seeing and how is it affecting businesses?
Well, I think the first thing is it's affecting so much of what they do, not just the obvious things that regulation brings, such as compliance needs, the need to deal with regulators, but things like transactional support, understanding the regulatory architecture and issues that businesses that you are buying or merging with face, commercial disputes, and then the whole broader piece of policy engagement with government and other stakeholders, that too. In terms of the types of regulation involved as well, it's a very broad menu, as well as the obvious things like classic energy regulation, environmental rules. We're seeing a lot of our specialist areas called on to get to grips with this new world. My own area, antitrust competition, for example, where the UK regulator is now looking at the EV charging market, thinking about pricing, transparency, consumer protection, those kinds of issues. But many other areas too, data protection, cybersecurity, for example. It's interesting also the way it's affecting other sectoral regulations. So I'm thinking of transport, of financial services, of telecoms. All of these things are happening.
That's interesting. Thank you, Mark. And from my side, I mean, there are two trends that I'm seeing in particular. One is revenue stacking, where businesses are increasingly having to add to the sources of revenue that they can access in order to be successful with their projects. So building beyond the simple sale of electricity in the wholesale markets, adding perhaps a government subsidy, but increasingly looking to participate through the regulatory regime in selling services to the grid or in taking customers off grid. And in order to be able to do that, customers and businesses need to have a deep understanding of the regulatory environment and are in some cases looking to exploit short-term loopholes to try to find ways to monetize and increase the access to revenue that they can find. So that's the first trend. The second trend is in relation to the regulation of ESG. We've moved from a world where ESG was an unregulated sector to a world where it's been governed by voluntary guidelines that businesses have complied with to raise, for example, green finance, sometimes with third-party verification to support that. We're clearly moving to a world where ESG and green are going to be regulated specifically. The EU has recently published a taxonomy on green, which starts to codify what is and what isn't green. And that's an important step towards moving to a world where there will be fiscal and other incentives and penalties for being green or for failing to be green. And so that's a clear direction of travel that we're seeing in the market. Mark, from your perspective, what other trends are you seeing?
Well, I mean, there's so much to talk about, and I suspect if you talk to any of the other regulatory lawyers in our global regulatory group, they may have different issues at the top of their agenda, but a couple I would mention are, I mean, first of all, so much of these initiatives involve government support, whether sort of direct subsidies or incentive regimes in one way or another, to help the market change. And with that comes in rules about subsidy control in the EU, so-called state aid rules and so on. So that's definitely a trend I'm seeing. The other thing that I'm seeing is the increasing demands of economic regulation, such as price controls in markets where there's a network or a piece of infrastructure that isn't subject to normal competitive dynamics, and what companies are facing there in terms of the expectations of regulators, in terms of performance, the incentives that are put on them, the outputs they deliver, is always developing and becoming more demanding. So we're seeing a lot of that.
For us as a law firm, I mean, we work with one of the largest global regulatory practices of any law firm in the world. And I think what we're increasingly seeing is regulation and the regulatory skill set becoming a differentiator in terms of how clients think of law firms and select their law firms, even for perhaps traditional transactions like large corporate M&A or large structured or other financings. And I think that comes from the fact that there's a deeper appreciation of the importance of the regulatory environment to being able to monetize and optimize those assets. And so we're seeing clients look for lawyers who've got that industry sector lens and that expertise in order to be able to support them in those areas.
Yeah, that definitely reflects my experience. I mean, these kinds of issues are moving from sort of checklist issues to effectively deal-breaking issues very often.